and action to approve the amendment to Board Policy CT Local Facilities Planning. This is the second read. This was a proposal sponsored by Trustee Flores. And Trustee Flores, I'll let you lead the discussion on this.
Sure, absolutely.
Tell us summarize what the proposal is.
Well, basically, it's to come up with some kind of metrics that let us, gather some data and come up with some decision-making around the possibility of consolidating or closing schools based on three, primary factors: the school performance framework, the facilities condition index, and the sustainability. In other words, how, the occupancy of the facility, and then come up with some metrics. And so, I proposed this and been discussing this for a long time, and the administration took it back and looked at it, and we put it back on, and I talked to Dr. Blackburn about kind of the parameters, and, versus the last version of this. So the administration asked, let us have the flexibility, the decision-making on kind of the process aspects of it. If you guys will just kind of stick to the kind of big picture, what are the percentages of the different categories. And so Trustee Blackburn and I kind of went back and forth on that, and so this is where we have landed, which is and it's sitting in front of you, 50% school performance framework, and 30 and 20, I think, is where it ended up. And then it also, of course, everything has to come back to the Board of Trustees. And then the other thing that got taken out was that it was mandatory, so now it's kind of, the administration would make a recommendation, and then, the board, after having followed the process that they'll set up, we will then, make decisions around that. And so then Scott, having now the numbers, I guess, ran some data on the metrics just to give us an idea of what the answer would look like. And not surprisingly, the answer looks like a lot like what we talked about earlier today. So that's where we are, and so that's why I'm bringing it back to the board for discussion and vote this month.
Okay, Scott, would you like to add something?
Yeah, just a couple of comments. What's changed between first reading and second reading? In that first paragraph, before that last sentence said shall be slated for consolidation, and that's been changed to shall be considered. So it takes a lot of the mandatory type language out of this policy. Also, over in process and timelines, the first reading had the percentages at 50%, 40%, and 10%, and those have been changed to 60% for financial, 30% for SPF, and 10% for the FCI. And then the old first reading had very detailed guidelines on how this would occur, and we've taken those out, and we will include those as a part of a regulation, a CT regulation. And we do not have that done yet because we need to give some thought on how that will work, and we want to make sure. And again, regulations only defines a process. It's not the policy. Basically, this policy says every October we'll bring this worksheet to you to look at and consider, and from that point on, we'll look at regulations and so forth.
Okay, just before I turn it over for questions, I just want to understand, the administration is supporting this version of the policy?
Yes, sir.
Change. And Dr. Blackburn, as policy chair, you've reviewed this with Trustee Flores, and you're okay with this?
Yep.
Okay. All right, Trustee Marshall.
I was first.
Go.
Okay, let's go to page 1, and let me understand this. Equity of access and resource for every student is possible by 1, asset to a broad spectrum of supports and programs at each campus, appropriate distribution of high-quality personnel, facilities that are safe and meet a reasonable standard for providing educational service. And 4, maximizing the resources provided to each school through the efficient use of finance, human capital, and facilities of the district. As such, schools that for 2 consecutive years fail to provide a high-quality education, fail to provide equitable support and services for students, and fail to maintain a minimum level of facilities condition and enrollment shall be considered for consolidation or closure at least 18 months in advance of closing. That's the policy that we're proposing. The nutshell, right?
Yes,
it's
ma'am.
what you're proposing. So let's go to the page of the equity education equity list. But first, let me understand. We're doing an equity survey. We hired HKS, is that correct, Scott?
PBK.
And out of that, they're going to come up with FCI.
Correct. They will revise.
So they're going to come up with FCI, the normalized FCI. So I understand there are going to be 3 FCIs that they're going to come up with? Because I see it on this version. I see normalized FCI, then FCI score, which are 2 different numbers.
Okay, and let me explain that. On this chart, what you've got to remember is we're dealing with 3 different pieces of data. Okay, the SPF is on a scale of 1 to 5. The financial...
Tell me what SPF means.
School performance framework.
School performance, framework.
Okay, so that's on a scale of 1 to 5. The financial is just based on a cost per student, based on what is spent. So it's really not on a scale. Whereas the facility condition index is on a scale from 0 to 100. So when we say normalized, what we're doing is trying to get the same denominator for each area. So for SPF, since it's on a scale of 1 to 5, whatever that number is, it's multiplied by 20.
So give me an example of what I just read and what the formula you're using. Which school would be recommended today to be closed or consolidated and notified within 18 months?
Well,
Tell me, if I look at this chart, I'm a parent, I'm a community member, and this chart is public. Tell me which schools by your chart will be recommended for consolidation of closure.
it would be page 7.
7 or 8.
North Dallas, Twain, Carr, Ray, Edison.
So
and-
today, we will have North Dallas, Twain, Carr, Ray, Edison, and Earhart.
If that's what we brought back to you.
I'm trying to understand.
Okay.
So that means you will bring this to the board to recommend closing or consolidation of these schools. Now, let's go back to the policy. Now, I really think it's quite interesting. We're bringing this policy, and I'm reading it. If all things are equal, we just passed a $1.6 billion bond, and if all things were equal, we get the same starting line. All schools have the same starting line. You have today Hawthorne Elementary that was number 1 on the FCI report. It's getting $2 million. You have today several other schools that are not getting what they need by, the building use. You have today where we bought the FAIR plan, Dr. Hinojosa bought all these plans because schools needed more money. Today. You have the day that you're not using your attendance boundary and doing that correctly. So those schools are put at a disadvantage already. Are we, the district, prepared to get them all at the same starting line where the building is perfect, 100%, everything's fixed, the principal who has it, where you have resources, all of us are equally distributed resources? This, to me, is not a fault of the community in which that school reside in, nor the parents and the students, nor the principal or the teacher's fault. This is a board's thing that we have to put, as trustee, I think it was Flores said, put your money where your mouth is, basically. So we are willing to put a policy in place when we have not corrected the wrongs, South Oak Cliff, all the schools, yet. We're bringing a policy forward to say in 18 months, this board will close schools based on finance, human capital, and facilities of the district. So if you in school do not respond to air condition problems at a school, they're going to get rated on that, and then they could potentially be closed. Then facilities that are safe and meet a reasonable standard for providing educational service. What is that reasonable standard? And have the district themselves gave schools in the communities rules of engagement of what that standard will be. For education, provided each school through the efficient use of finance. What do you mean by efficient use of finances? We give schools their budget. Am I right, Larry Throne? That's correct. Okay, we give schools the budget, right? Okay, we. Here, okay, I just want to make sure. So efficient use of finances, they're given the budget that we give them to use. Human capital, vacancies, 134, so I don't have teachers. Facilities of the district. This, to me, is all wrong. We're doing a racial equity study, and here you are, schools that are already at a disadvantage, talking about you're going to close them within 18 months.
Well,
How dare you? And you know what? And I want you to get, how dare you? How dare you? The schools in South Dallas, in the southern sector, had to fight and beg and still begging for stuff. And then y'all going to come with this to close our schools because we're going to be impacted first. I'm underpopulated. Am I right? The schools over in the South that would be
Mr. President, I don't
impacted.
think it's necessary for a trustee to be attacking a board.
I'm not attacking him. I'm having a conversation.
How dare you?
What you did to us is attack. Let's clarify, Dustin.
Can you please take
Justin.
control of this?
I'm not attacking. We're having a conversation. We're debating, deliberating, discussing. And I have the right to feel a certain way when a policy is put forth. I'm not mad at all. But I'm frustrated that you're putting a policy forward and we have not been given a playing field. We have not been given the opportunity. Skyline is over there with 28 portables. But yet you're going to say, if you don't do this. No, I want us to think about how this impacts communities.
Trustee Foreman.
He said I was next.
No, she was next.
I do understand Trustee Nuttall's frustration. And Scott, because you're relatively new to the school district, not to the area, but to the school district. The way this policy is structured, it would impact schools that have been hurting the most. It would impact areas that's been hurting the most. And so that's why you have some of the frustration. And let me just say that Mark Twain is in my district. It is underpopulated, but guess what? It's a vanguard that had no programs really. Is that their fault? It's not their fault. But the way this policy is, then it puts it on them. When we talk about facilities, I appreciate the work you've done to try to meet out, and I'm still looking at Kimball, but I appreciate the work you've done to try to make sure that some of these schools that have been struggling in terms of facilities get the extra assistance that they need. But we're not there. I have 29 schools in my district. Trustee Nuttall and Trustee Blackburn, I think, are the ones that have more
32 and 30.
more schools than me. So this kind of gives me pause because the schools are not ready for this. So when you talk about if the facilities, schools that for 2 consecutive years failed to provide a high-quality education, what does that look like?
Let me jump in right here, and let me clarify that this policy was created by board members, and we're trying to make it work.
A board
So
member.
A board member.
I don't want Mr. Lane to be under attack. Why
I'm
don't you
not
guys
attacking
attack
him.
me and not
Okay.
Mr. Lane?
All right,
And-
step back, let me
But Dr. Hill, let's clarify, it's not attack, it's a conversation. And this city cannot have deep conversations of debate. We're
Okay.
debating.
I'm not attacking.
I'm not
Scott.
attacking.
I think I'm trying to be gracious in the way I'm addressing this with some bit of hesitation in being gracious because it appears that the way this policy is structured, it would hurt the neediest schools. And one of the things we're trying to do, and I thank Stephanie for really trying to help to find programs to put into some of these schools. But if you implement something like this, then next year you'd have a list that could be detrimental to some of these schools. So that's a problem. So we haven't defined what a high-quality education is. We talk about equitable support. Who gives the support? It's the district. So is that the school's fault? It's not the school's fault, but we're going to use it as a metrics. That wouldn't be fair. And then fail to maintain a minimal level of facilities conditions. That also is the school district. That's not the school's fault. So we're going to be, there are 3 measures in here that we're going to be holding them accountable for, but it's the policies that we use around this board that would be difficult for me. Then I went on to, under school consolidations or closings, under number 1, it talks about space utilization. And so it says the space available at a school or school in close proximity is not being used in the most efficient and cost-effective manner. Again, that is something that I think the district, not the school's fault, but the district's, because it would be what programs you put in there, those kinds of things. So that's a problem. Of course, we've already talked about the physical condition, which is not the school's fault. That's the district's fault. And then on number 3, it talks about the alternative use of school facilities. The board may consolidate or close a school to use its facilities for other programmatic educational processes, for support services, to open a new school or to expand an existing school. We're kind of dealing with some of that today earlier in terms of how we look at consolidating schools or closing schools. And that's a very emotional issue for communities, especially for communities that have struggled and tried to get the district to be more equitable. There are some trustees around this table who do not have the same issues I have in District 6. They really haven't had to fight for very much of anything. But I have. And then, of course, the number 4 just kind of really sends me up another level, because we have board members on here that have been board members of charter schools. I don't support charter schools. Not in my district. Out of 32,000 kids that could be in DISD, 17,000 are in my district. So anything that has charter to do with this district sends me to another level. And for those who support charters, get them in your district. I don't want them. And then on number 5, it talks about changing demographics. Demographic studies indicate a change in the continued need for the school. So I don't quite understand that. Because if you're talking about a loss of students, I could understand the change in the loss of students based on maybe something that the city did to tear down an apartment complex or something. But I don't see how the demographic shift, it goes from one group to another group. I don't see how the demographic shift would change anything. Okay, but it doesn't matter. I want it changed.
What do you say?
You said that's in the existing policy.
That's not part of the proposed change. I wanted to make sure
Sure,
that
but
you were aware of
we're
it.
working on the whole policy.
Fair game to discuss. I
Thank
just wanted to
you.
make sure
Oh,
you knew it
man.
wasn't part of the
Okay.
proposal.
Yes, it is.
We used, number 5, we used changing demographics before, and we built schools, Scott. Conrad, Jack Lowe, Tasby, didn't have any student population there. We got a Defa Kaleo, new school, underpopulated. Do we fault them for that? Of course we don't. Of course we don't. We shouldn't. And then, number 6, which talks about the legal requirement, which I don't understand. What legal requirement would we have to close or consolidate a school?
IR status.
Then maybe we could put that in there. That would be IR status. It would make more sense to me.
Ms. Mormon, those are all a part of the original policy.
I
I'm
know, and
not
I'm
sure
trying
you were aware
to,
of
if we're
that.
going to clean it up, we need to clean it all
Understand.
up. That's what the good president was trying to tell me, but I was trying to tell him, if we're going to do it, then we need to do it the right way and look at all of this. I still have a lot of reservations about this policy. When you start talking about it, I'm on 3 of 6. The financial sustainability score, which is 60%, I would assume that is gauged on student population and enrollment. But if we're talking about consolidating, or if there's an opportunity to consolidate, it would still be on that list, which doesn't make sense to me. Because if we see, for instance, we've had conversations about Mark Twain and the issues at Twain. And because the district has not done what it should have done to make sure that there was a real Vanguard school over there. So we're looking at trying to do something, but currently the way this is stated, that school would be on this list. And so I have some concerns about that. The school performance framework is obviously something that we have created ourselves, but it doesn't say where on the school performance framework. Is it the F category? Is it the C category? Is it the D category? Where on the school performance framework would this fall? And I know you wouldn't know that, Scott. Maybe the superintendent knows.
Actually, all of these, it's not a letter grade, it's the times the percentage, and then all of our schools would be ranked. So every single school's
So-
points from SPF would be multiplied by, is that one 40%? 40%, and then the financial sustainability, whatever that is for every school, times 50%, and then the bottom 10% with regard to the facilities. And then all the schools would be ranked, and then we just say, here are the schools that are at the very bottom, if you will, from this listing. And that's why I think the wording on the policy that was of most importance to Scott was that the shall was changed to may.
Yeah,
So that all of this would simply be, here are the schools that we have
But-
that have these challenges.
But
What
let me
would
tell you where I am.
Yes,
And
ma'am.
you know I love you because I think you do great work.
Oh, thank you.
But let me tell you where I am. And I told the president this. The people who are speaking up now, those are the people who their schools will be affected.
7 of them.
And you got 5 board members on here that vote against us all the time.
Yes.
And
5,
so
4.
that is a concern of mine, is that putting this policy in place don't mean the right things would happen for children, particularly children in my area. And so I have to make sure that it's right and it's going to be equitable and fair before I can agree to it.
Understood.
Okay. Trustee Marshall.
So it sounds like maybe there's some need to involve Trustee Foreman and some of the further edits to this policy of it changing some of the existing language. So I'll reserve any comment or question on that. But my interpretation of this, Dr. Flores, was that this was not only, I guess I'm a little confused by the positioning of some of the questions that have been asked so far, because it seems like some of my colleagues are really concerned about this being a punitive tool that's brought to bear on schools that are failing on one of these dimensions, whereas I had considered it, since there's an 18-month time period after a school gets on the list, I was thinking of it as a tool where every October, the administration would come to the board and say, look, we haven't devoted enough resources to the facilities of this school. We haven't devoted enough resources to the operations or the programming of this particular school, and the enrollment is too low, so we need to perhaps consider a boundary change or pull on some lever that will get this school off of the bottom of the list, which actually, if you think about it with that lens, getting on the bottom of this list, unless I'm misreading things, would actually help you improve, because you've been recognized as somebody that's a candidate for closure in the next 18 months if the board doesn't change things. Is that how you were thinking about it, or is it once you're on the list you're closed?
No, not at all. I mean, the original version of this outlined in great detail the steps that the administration was required to take once these schools fell out. And I know nothing about Twain. Today's like the first day that I've ever heard an extended discussion about Twain. It concerns me greatly that it's a Vanguard or whatever those things are called, and that it isn't getting maybe the resources that maybe a Travis does or another. I mean, this is helping put the transparency and the order and the emphasis on, the administration, the same way that we have our goal progress, our student outcome measures and our goal progress measures and all that good stuff, where we're focusing on very distinct populations. This is creating the same thing, but just with numbers.
So is it
And
fair to
so-
say that the administration's intent would be to write some regulation within this policy that says if a school makes it on the list in October, then the administration is going to take the following 10 steps to get it off the list by investing in whatever the underlying poor number was that got it on the list in the first place?
Well, I think that's fair, and that's why we didn't just take what was in the policy and say this is going to be the regulation. I think there needs to be a lot more discussion on what we're truly trying to do here. Help the schools, or close the schools, and I don't think that was
Well,
the intent.
I for one, I like the idea of taking politics out of a decision whenever it's possible. And in this case, having a more formulaic approach to identify a school that may need to be closed or consolidated, I think is a positive thing, whether that's in my district or in anybody else's district. And, I know that some of my colleagues from, that have already spoken have concerns about Southern Dallas schools and the enrollment of charter schools in those districts. But that is, since charter schools are taking kids away from schools in Southern Dallas, those kids being absent is what's triggering those schools being on this list. And so those issues are related to one another. We can't bemoan the fact that all the kids are going to charter schools and then take no action on our end to stop it or to recognize that the schools are under-enrolled and we can't continue to operate them. We've got to do one of those two things. But I do have a couple of, I guess, math questions related to this. I've had the same question that Trustee Nuttall did about the schools on the bottom of the list. If you look at whatever this is, page 8 or page 7 of 8 in the colorful document, the previous version of this policy, if I'm not mistaken, before it was edited, had a threshold in there where it said if you're below a certain line, then you qualify for the list. But I don't see that in the current version of the policy. So how did you decide where to draw the line? It looks like you drew it at 32 on the EES index, but
It's 3% of the schools.
so is that still in the new version of the policy?
No, it's not in the policy.
But that's
All
what
right.
the old version of the policy said.
Correct.
Right. So
Correct.
you just kept it at 3% for
I did.
purposes of this slide?
Yeah.
But are
because-
you suggesting that every October y'all would bring us the bottom 3%?
No, the policy says we'll bring you this report, okay? So we'll list them top to bottom, not
Right,
necessarily
but there's a
showing.
difference between you listing them from top to bottom and you drawing this little separate black box at the bottom. And when Trustee Nuttall asked you which ones would you close, you read off those 6. My question is, who's to say that there weren't 4 or who's to say that there weren't 8? Like, where did you draw the line?
And I think we drew the line on this one because that was in the policy,
Because
and
it
we
was the
didn't
old
read,
version
because
of
it was
the
the old
policy.
version.
Okay,
To your point, that's why,
So
yes.
Trustee Blackburn, I'm assuming you were involved in the edits to Dr. Flores' original policy. So was it your intent to keep it at the 3%?
Just so you know, we asked for the report that you see up here to see how would it look.
Yeah.
And I think that's why if it says the bottom 3%, that's what they came from. We want to see what would it look like if we were to go with
I get it, but the
original
policy that
version.
we'll be voting on doesn't say 3%.
Right.
So in the future, when you are bringing this, all you will do is have a list that's ranked, and you will say, here are the schools at the bottom.
Do what,
But-
and we would, and we,
Just like you said, it's 5.
Too many, oh, we need to turn off some mouse.
5 to do whatever they want.
so we would be bringing, then here's the list, and I might, let's go ahead and take this list and let's pretend that line wasn't there. I'd be saying, well, Earhart, we already consolidated, so, because that wouldn't even be on here anymore. Edison, we are bringing you a plan. Ray, we're bringing a plan. Carr, we're bringing a plan. Twain, I'm bringing a plan. The only one I wouldn't have on this currently would have been a plan for North Dallas.
Well, that's what I was
But that
thinking,
would
because
be
we spent hours
correct.
talking about several of these schools this morning. If the line had been drawn one down,
then I would have
Then
had,
you've already
we
talked
would have
about
been
all of
bringing
them.
you a plan for all of these.
Yeah.
And so we've been already working on, and actually it came, Trustee Foreman had asked me before, give me a list of schools that are between this number and this number. So that's actually how I generated, how we ended up with like, okay, we have this many schools that are under 300, but greater than 200. What can I do this next time? So we already took 3 of those, if you all work with us on part of what we brought you earlier, that possibly Sudie Williams, J.W. Ray, and Mark Twain would already be addressed. And then I have 5 others that we would be working to bring something that would, again, increase the enrollment, keep students, et cetera.
Okay. So it does beg the question, though, if you bring us this list every October, and there's 3 schools at the bottom of it that you have a plan for, why, where do we stop? Like, are we not going to look at the 4th school and the 5th school? Like, to my point of trying to take politics out of this, one of the things I liked about the last version of the policy was that it did have a cutoff that said, here are the schools we're going to talk about. If you just bring us a list, there's going to be more politics around where the line is drawn. And I think the intent of this policy, at least as I see it, one of the pros, the advantages of it is taking politics out of it. So I do think there needs to be some guidance that the board provides to the administration that says, here is the number of schools or and I don't really want it to be a forced bell curve either, but there needs to be some guidance of, hey, bring us the worst performing 5 schools or the worst performing 2% or whatever those are, so that we're having a structured conversation rather than letting politics get into it. And then the last question I have real quick is, I think we're all pretty familiar with the SPF and the FCI. This FSS score is a little nebulous to me. I think it was originally based off of a break-even financial analysis chart that we were given several months ago that showed that the enrollment for an elementary school needed to be over X before it was sort of financially operating in the black, and for a middle school it needed to be over Y. I'm interested in if anybody can tell me what the enrollment numbers would need to be for an elementary, middle, and upper school or high school in order to get above, get a good FSS score.
So it depends on what philosophical approach you use as to how much administrative overhead is then assigned to each campus. And so I think some of the numbers that were presented by our former CFO to you actually had overhead from central office attached to each school, but it wasn't attached based on the percentage of the enrollment at each school. So there were some numbers that didn't necessarily make sense. Right now, based on the numbers we've run in school leadership, it's about 440, 450 for an elementary, but I'd like to respond to all of the trustees with the exact number in a tracker, either
Yeah, no,
tomorrow or Monday.
That's fine. I guess the root sort of underlying question of my question is, when you talk about FSS, I think that's really just a euphemism for enrollment and percentage of capacity of the building. So I'm wondering if I'm wrong on that, and if I'm not wrong on that, then why we're not just talking about percent of capacity.
The FSS is based on expenditures relative to student enrollment.
What does it cost to run a school, and at what number of enrollment am I breaking even?
But the primary driver, I mean, you could argue that the 2 drivers of that are
Enrollment.
enrollment and the capacity of the building, right? Because there's more expense associated with operating a larger building. What are the other big cost drivers? Well, but payroll's related to the number of students and the number and the size of the building.
Different schools have different levels of administrative support, so that's why IDEA is on the bottom of this list. They have a lot of administrative
Okay,
support.
yeah, that's a good point.
Yeah.
All right, well, yeah, if you could get me some information about how FSS is calculated, that would help me understand this a little better prior to the vote. Thanks.
Okay, anyone else? Okay. Trustee Pinkerton.
Yeah, so I wanted to follow up on what Trustee Marshall was saying about the intent of this really being to try to identify schools where we may need to make some improvements or take some kind of action, not necessarily closing or consolidating the school. And so I'd like to propose an alternate approach to this, because this policy is really written around closing. the board, the administration will bring a list of schools to be considered for closing and consolidation. But what if we tried to follow along with this idea that we would define a minimum standard for the school's condition, for the school performance framework, right? And then also financially. And we would use this policy to identify those for the purpose of figuring out what we need to do to bring the school up to the minimum standard, not a percentage at the bottom. Because if we get all of our schools off of IR status and we're going to be down at 5 this year and then it'll be at 0 the following year, if we get them all off of IR status, maybe we say they're all adequate, right? I mean, whatever it is. I mean, that we might, but I think the preamble to this says failing to provide an adequate, whatever, however it's worded, educational services and safe and et cetera, et cetera. So what if we define some minimum parameters around these 4 items, commit to identifying every year schools that don't meet that minimum, where we're saying this is unacceptable for these students, and then we leave it to administration to figure out what do we need to do about that, and they bring that to the board. Could we, Dr. Flores, would you accept that as an alternate approach to try to accomplish what you're trying to accomplish?
Something to talk about, but right now, this is the only vehicle that we have in front of us, and certainly it would
Microphone.
focus help. Oh, sorry. It would certainly help focus the attention on things like boundaries, because boundaries could easily solve one of, one or two
Exactly.
of these. But
Okay.
absent some, basically a TEA commissioner getting rid of the board and the superintendent type level event, it seems to me like, we just say, well, they're on the list, and yeah, we'll do something about it, and maybe we'll have mentors and some people helping, and, we'll team up with a partner, and nothing happens. And so that's why this was the vehicle that I selected, because I think that it really will put the focus on those schools that are really the most in need, in fact, because to me, it seems like the data, using these metrics and the changes by Dr. Blackburn on the percentages, highlights almost exactly the same list of schools, completely serendipitously, by the way, because I don't have access to this data and I have no way of running these reports, with what we talked about this morning.
Could I make a suggestion for consideration? In the policy language that we're presenting to you on 1 of 6, it says that last sentence, be considered for, right? And I think then the words are consolidation or closure. What if we added like and/or improvements and/or like specifically say there's another option other than, like these are the only 2 things we would be considering, would be maybe attendance boundaries.
You took the words right out of my mouth. And
Yes,
as we were going through this discussion, the idea was that we'd identify schools that are in some need of trouble or assistance, and there are only 2 options that are listed here. One is consolidation, the other is closure. There should be a 3rd category, which would be additional resources or other changes that would improve the situation. Yes, Dr. Flores.
So I think that that's a great point. We were talking about the in-district proposal, in-district charter proposal. We talked about innovation schools and transformation. I mean, those could easily be, choice school, because that's kind of the catch-all, or choice programs, we could say, or choice program, or closure, consolidated, or choice program.
That's not quite broad enough in terms of what I think the rest of us are saying, is that we're really, if the point of this is to identify schools that have a need, let's just say that. Let's say we're trying to identify schools that aren't meeting our minimum standard, and I'm in favor of defining the minimum so that we're not talking about 3% year over year over year where, at the end of time, we're approaching, 0 schools in the district. So, I know it's not. But anyway, you understand the point. And I guess here's the other thing that makes me feel a little uncomfortable, and that is that this refers to, the heart of this, the meat of this is in CT regulation, which we just heard, isn't written yet, so you're asking us to vote on something that we really don't understand what the regulation would look like. Could we, I know it's customary to vote on a second read, but could we push this back to a third read, give a little bit of time maybe to work on some proposed language that would be acceptable to Trustee Flores and the other trustees, and really make this a good, long-term facility planning?
I second that. I think that's a great idea.
Dr. Blackburn.
I think it's a good idea because we've already put it off for a month or two. Sounds like another policy we put off, kept putting off, but that's good. But just for a little bit of background, at one point, we did have a policy, and I'm not sure if it was here or somewhere else, where we actually talked about when do we consider closing the school because it gets to be too small, the population gets to drop. When do we decide, that we're going to close the school? I know back in 12, we said everything below 250. Wasn't in policy, although at one point, we did have something along that line that once you got below 400 students, then we have to start thinking about what are we going to do? Do we change boundary lines? Do we pump it up some kind of way? Or do we just, close the school? So when we talk about bidding CT, that's where I think it's where it was before. But if we're talking about equity, and I think I talked to Edwin about this too, if we're talking about equity and having all the best things at the schools that we should have, are we talking about facilities or are we talking about programming? And whether it's going to be in CT or somewhere else, we do want to make sure that we give all of our kids the best education environment that we can. And sometimes that means having some of the better teachers and spread out throughout the district and not just in one school or one feeder or things of that nature. But just for background information, at one time we did have a policy where we talked about once you got below 400 students, then we have to start thinking about something. What that something is different. It's what the board and administration work on.
Sure, and that's the financial sustainability piece of this, so.
Okay, Trustee Nuttall.
Can we add administration to this as well? Discuss the buildings, administration buildings, and how they operate as part of this policy? Come up with some kind of formula to look at that? We're here for children, and it's all about the school's efficiency, which we drive that efficiency. So it seems that the same rules should apply for all of our buildings, not just our school. Huh?
Bus barn?
It should apply for all our schools and departments. So I want that as a friendly amendment.
We don't
And
have a bus barn.
Scott knows, me and Scott debate all the time. He good. He used to.
Okay,
What?
can I go now?
So, no, wait, I had one more. I wouldn't finish, Trustee Foreman,
Oh, I'm sorry.
before you go. So are we proposing to take all this other policy out? So if I look at this correctly, I'm just trying to understand, because I'm going to have a community meeting about this one, y'all. We got to know. If I look correctly, Stephanie, you said you would just bring North Dallas, and Dustin asked a question. You wouldn't take it up to the next tier level of schools?
I was saying, based on what's in the reg, we are thinking, why would we have a line at all? Although I also understood Trustee Marshall's point of, it makes it easier possibly for you all if there's a line so that you all aren't deciding on where that line is. But from our perspective, there's always going to be a set of schools at the bottom. I mean, whatever that bottom is. And so that's why I also thought Trustee Pinkerton's like, where's the threshold, though, of where is it, to also Dr. Blackburn's point of at what number is that? And maybe that's the part that needs to be static, is here's the number.
Okay, because like you said, you're taking care of Earhart, Edison, Ray, Carr. So the two schools, in theory, you would bring would be Twain, is it Mark Twain?
Twain.
And North Dallas. So you would, but that line would change because those schools would be gone. And so that means we'll get into Robert E. Lee, Pillar, Carver, Hernandez. Because when I went from the bottom up, I have 7 schools, and 2 of them are high schools. So would there not be any other consideration in this policy? Because if you go from the bottom up, I have James Madison, Lincoln. Where's my list? I wrote it on something else. J.J. Rhodes, that would be like in that list. But James Madison and Lincoln would be the 2 high schools. Madison is one from Twain, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 up.
from last year's data, but every year we'd be rerunning it. So for instance, when Lincoln and Madison get out of IR, they will have more points and they'll go higher up on this list. But meaning every year it's going to be, there could be different schools.
But see, another thing we got to think about, there has to be some accountability for administration when we're moving all these principals. Because the principal in Madison got moved, hadn't been IR, it went IR and been IR for 3 years. So this to me, it requires a whole lot of variables to look at before you decide to impact a community like that. And there are variables that's beyond the control of the students, the principal, and the community. So we need to really, this needs to, Dr. Blackburn as the policy chair, this needs to be pushed back and discussed way, until we figure out what we're doing here, till you get the study of the racial equity study, until you get, is it HKS or PBS? PBK? I don't know. Till you get that study, I think before we visit a policy like this, also until we know if the commissioner's going to take the SFP model, SPF model, all these acronyms. Do you see where I'm going? You have a lot of moving parts out here that are going to determine a whole lot. 2 studies we're paying for, racial, that other one. Then you got this other thing that we're trying to do to see if the commissioner is going to take that, plus the rules of engagement when they come in on November the 15th. Plus, I think before we visit this policy, Dr. Blackburn, this needs to be put on a shelf, let all of this other stuff work itself through, and then pull this out to talk about until you get to a science with this. Because you have to think about their people that live in the communities, their students that live in the communities, and you got to think about the impact of that on people. It's just not that simple, and it's politics and everything.
So how about we have a House version and a Senate version?
Well, I'm having a community meeting, and I'm getting ready to give them CT local policy and the data, because if this policy, because as my colleague over there said, what did he say? A 5-4 vote. Did he not say that?
That was me.
That was you?
Okay, we're on
I'm just
topic.
saying, they got 5
Trustee-
votes to do whatever they want, people. South Dallas, wake up.
So,
Stay woke.
So
Trustee Foreman.
I think Trustee Pinkerton had a good idea. When you bring a policy forward that appears to be somewhat punitive towards certain communities, because these would be comprehensive schools. They wouldn't be your choice schools, and then some of us don't have a lot of choice schools in our area. And so you do get the emotions that come up. But I have no problem with looking at a policy that would identify the schools that need the most help. We should be doing that anyway. And I know that we put this on the back burner, but Dr. Blackburn, the race doesn't always go to the swift. So I'm not in a hurry. You know, so we're going to put it on the back burner again. That's okay with me till we get it right. And I think I have enough faith in you guys to know that you can come up with something that is not going to seem punitive, but will be able to identify the schools that we really need to try to enhance. And I just want to say that in 2012, there was a threshold of 250 students where the schools would be closed. D.A. Halsey had 500 students. And guess what? It was closed. So I know the politics of this board. I've been around a long time. I know the politics. And so I just have to be careful that we are making a good decision, and rushing a decision is not always the answer. I have enough faith and trust in you guys that you can take what Trustee Pinkerton said, which makes a lot of sense. Identifying the schools that will need some assistance. At some point, maybe some of those will close. but not with the thought of how are we going to close these schools. Looking at where we could maybe be able to create some choice schools or whatever, be able to enhance the schools instead of a policy that looks at closure.
Okay, Trustee Solis.
Thank you, Mr. President. How the FCI is 10% of the current formula that's being proposed. How are you thinking about that as it relates to this broader strategic plan that the superintendent has spoken about, and how FCIs may change related to a new assessment we would conduct?
Well, they're definitely going to change, and actually the FCIs change every year. As we complete renovations, they get better. As we don't complete renovations, they get worse because the equipment ages more and it impacts the number. So we do that every January. We revise the FCIs for every school in the district.
That's helpful. When I read the policy, though, it reads as if, as it begins, were it to be adopted, we would be generating our results from the Parsons report. Sounds like with this new plan that we plan on, we're going to do a new assessment, so there would be
Correct.
a new quote-unquote Parsons report.
Correct.
I think that's something for the board to consider as well. I would hate to immediately adopt a policy that then generates a set of outcomes that then a year later, in hindsight, we're going, oh man, maybe we shouldn't have closed that school because the FCI wasn't exactly what we thought it was based on the Parsons report. Just something to consider in thinking about scrutinizing the policy. The second thing would be, it would be interesting to hear, I guess right now we're operating from theoretically, what end we're seeking in executing this policy. What I assume, based on the conversations that I've heard to date on this, is that it frees us up from a monetary standpoint to do something else because we are closing down schools that are draining resources right now, more than anything else. So I guess, Trustee Flores, first, clarify for me with this policy to what end? What are we ultimately intending on doing with this?
So I think it's the intent of the formula is, first of all, to come up with a list where it's just numbers, it's just data, right? And originally these numbers were very different. The percentages were very different. But I think that we have, continued to look at the financial sustainability, whether or not there are enough kids versus what's being spent, whether it's on maintenance or it's on operations or it's on payroll or whatever it is being spent at that school. And if the school is 80 years old, its cost of operation is a lot higher than one that we opened last year, right? So there is that factor, and so that's part of the financial sustainability score. The school performance framework score is, as we've been developing the school performance framework, but what's important about that number is that it deals with an issue we ran into in 2012, which is that we used, and Dr. Blackburn was just talking about, for the elementary schools, we used the threshold, right?
Yeah.
If you were below this number. However, a couple of those schools were high-performing schools, right? And so we were, so these parents were showing up saying, hey, our school is performing. Why are you closing us? And I took that to heart. I'm like, well, that they make a really good argument. And so that's why, I actually had a much higher number for the school performance framework. It's been turned down a little bit, but that's fine. And then the 10% on the facilities condition index, again, an 80 or 90 or 100-year-old school, or one that was built in the 60s that was meant to have a, useful life of 20 years, and it's now starting to hit its 50-plus year threshold. We either fix it or we walk away from it. And so that was the thinking around these three parameters. I had when I developed this, I had absolutely no idea which schools would fall in there. In fact, I was pretty convinced at least one school in Board District 1 was going to end up in this list. Mm-hmm. But it probably didn't because of its school performance framework score.
Yeah.
But yet on a facilities condition index, it probably should be in this list. But again, it was just to come up with a number, to have the discussion, to have the list, and then to have a well thought out 2-year process by which we would start informing people and then give the campus and the administration the opportunity to fix. Because you look at the metrics, you know what the problem is. If it's facilities condition index, well then maybe this one should be put first. It should be in phase 1, not in phase 5. Why? Because then that fixes, it's a high-performing school otherwise. It's sustainable, but yet its condition is horrible.
Okay.
Right? So it kind of takes into, if you said, well, if we did, 33.3%, 33%, 33.3%, that'd be kind of a start where you say, well, they're all weighted equal.
Yeah.
But the way we ended up is that they're not weighted equal. And there are reasons why they're not weighted equal. We think that, at least I thought, and I agree with Dr. Blackburn, is that, the sustainability score is important and hence got the 60%. Why? And that's something that a campus can fix. Because
Yeah.
if you increase your enrollment, administration provides you with a Montessori program. Look at Mata. Mata was dead, dying, and
So
yet
let
now
me
it's
go,
growing.
let me go somewhere with that, because that, you.
So that was the intent.
Yeah. And that's helpful. It gives me a holistic view of kind of the intentions here and the theory around it as well. I get and agree with a lot of the inputs. My question is, have we, or are we willing to really think through the outputs? So the biggest thing that I pull from that is that there is, and I get a sense it's coming from this fiduciary responsibility. We have a fiduciary role to be fiscally responsible when it comes to the property that we own and the academic achievement of our kids, and that we have to ensure that we're consistently identifying opportunities to keep that hot, to deliver on that fiduciary responsibility. One of the other things, though, that I'm thinking about from a financial sustainability standpoint is that what happens, let's say that it doesn't matter, we close or we consolidate. What will happen to those buildings? What likely will happen to those buildings? Because if we kept the buildings, we would still have to keep up with the buildings, so there's still a running financial cost to us doing this. Theoretically, and by statute, we also, when closing those buildings, would have to at the very least offer those buildings to some other provider. Now, maybe it's financially makes sense for us to give those buildings to some of these other educational providers, because we can make a quick buck on that. But from a long-term standpoint, that may not make sense financially, because that's another building for then that operator to drain more kids from us, to then hurt us from a long-term standpoint financially. So I'm only bringing these things up because I've started to kind of really think about the full picture of how this might play out, but also to say to you, I think you've actually uncovered some stuff by putting these inputs there that might lead us to make some better decisions moving forward. Whether that's closure or consolidation, I'm not sold on just yet, but it is giving us a sense of more equity. It gives us an equity lens that I don't think we necessarily had before, and I'd be interested to see where we go with this policy as it relates to really striking at the heart of equity. Closure and consolidation may be a piece of that, but it could be a whole bunch of other stuff as well.
Okay, let me make a couple of comments and pick up where I left off before. I look at this policy as a tool to identify schools that have the biggest problems in the district. And Trustee Flores and Trustee Blackburn have come up with some metrics and some percentages to identify schools that have the biggest problems in terms of academic performance, enrollment, and the condition of the facilities, which I think is a 10% factor in that. I think the original version of this proposal that was discussed on the first read that says if a school is in this bottom 2%, 3%, whatever it was, then it will be closed or consolidated. I think what's evolved in the discussion here and in the discussions that Trustee Blackburn and Trustee Flores had is that, and others have sort of chimed in, that we could use this as a tool to identify schools that need appropriate action taken. These are our worst schools that we will just consider doing something about, as opposed to the original version, which was if you're in the bottom 2%, we're going to close or consolidate. Now what we've evolved to, I think, is an emerging consensus that we need to develop a tool to identify the worst schools in the district based on all of these metrics and do something about them. And that could include consolidating them. It could include closing them. It could include building them back up, adding resources. But all we're doing with the policy as we've discussed it after sort of the verbal amendments that we've been talking about is to say, these are schools that are problems. We need to address them on an annual basis and do something appropriate with them. And that's the whole range of actions. Close them, consolidate, fix them, put a choice school in there. And I think it's good to have a tool that does that. Some way other than just, hey, I was driving past school X and their population is really been declining and it looks like the building's falling apart and, they're close to IR, they're IR. This is a way to actually formalize and make a regular report based on thoughtful metrics of something that we should focus on. So I don't look at this in the way it was originally, I think, interpreted, which was we're going to close these schools and it's going to hurt this community. It's really now what we're saying is we're going to look at these schools because these are the schools that have the biggest problems and we need to do something appropriate. So if we could rework the language of the policy to embody that concept, then I would be in favor of moving forward with it. Okay, final word?
So it seems to me that sounds like, we would be, the administration would develop an action plan to address, the reasons, the basically the idea of, access, distribution of personnel, facilities, and resources, to address the reason why they're on this list. And whether that includes closure and consolidation, whatever, that could all be. I mean, unfortunately, it is the facilities planning, so it could still be here. It could be, placed somewhere else. But, requiring the administration to develop an action plan to address, those neediest schools.
Go ahead.
Can I have
Trustee
the last
Foreman.
word?
No, because I'm going to say something right after that. But go ahead.
Again, I have no concerns about a policy that would look at the neediest facilities. What I do have some concerns about is identifying for closure. That is, and so if that language can be taken out to some degree, if it can be taken out, not to some degree, then I would be in favor of looking at that, but making sure that in the regs that there is some clear identification on what we're talking about, because most of these schools, and I was just telling Trustee Solis, most of these schools will be comprehensive schools. So those are neighborhood schools. And that is not what we want to lose. So if that part can be taken out, you might help me.
So
Okay, round 4.
I just want to understand where are we and where are we going? Are we moving this down the road, Dr. Blackburn, until we get some more reports?
Need more reports. I think we need to still come to a conference with the Senate and the House and see if we can come up with some appropriate language. Maybe some language, about the facility, whether or not it opens or stays open or closed, and another language about the equity, making sure that we get the best educational, make sure we have the best staff there. So maybe we're talking about two different things, and maybe it needs to be split and put into two different policies.
So that's going to take some time. And then, so what I hear Trustee Mishke and Trustee Foreman and Trustee Pinkerton, so we're going to take this last line out and add for improvement, or you want to keep closing in 18 months, at least 18 months in advance of closing?
I think we need to work out the details of the language, but we're talking about doing having more options than just closing or consolidating. taking appropriate action, which means the appropriate action could be putting more resources in there, putting a choice school in there. But all we're doing is saying, as I'm understanding where we're headed, is we're just going to come up with a tool to use to identify the most struggling schools and then consider and take possible action as recommended by the administration as to what we're going to do to improve these schools. And it could include closing, it could include consolidating, it could include choice schools, it could include anything, but we're just trying to identify the schools that have the most needs.
So are we moving this, is this not coming for vote?
I do too.
Okay,
We need
just
some language
clarify.
change.
I was fine. Y'all
No, she
y'all
wasn't.
weak. Y'all ain't never been.
She wasn't fine. No, don't buy that.
Oh, and you married to a black woman, so you should know. Oh, I'm talking to Lou. And Lou and I talk.
Okay, let's move on to the minority contracting report. Annie, I hope you have enjoyed this free entertainment, and